Well, if you're a guest with us today, we're on a journey through the gospel according to Luke, where we are looking to see what God has to say to us about living life. And we're going to be looking specifically at what Jesus said, what he expects of us. But so far, God's just been getting us ready to hear that, to begin with worship. Last week, we left Joseph, Mary, and baby Jesus in the temple. It was Jesus' presentation, and Luke just continues the story, okay? He just jumps right on into it. Verse 39 of chapter 2 says, "When they had completed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth." We see here finally the return. This passage just kind of rounds out the whole first section that we've been going through. It began with Joseph and Mary leaving Nazareth to go to Bethlehem so they could take care of the census. And then we find while they were there, Mary gives birth to baby Jesus. We hear about the angels. We hear about the shepherds. And then there's a waiting time of purification, and then they go to the temple to present Jesus. And now Luke basically just says they went back home. This process, at a minimum, would have been about 2 months. Could have been longer, but let's just, about 2 months for all this to happen and for them to return home. And then Luke summarizes the next 30 years. In one verse, verse 40, "The boy, being Jesus, grew up and became strong, filled with wisdom, and God's grace was upon him." This big summary of his life, 30 years, and this is what Luke has to say, except for one story. And we have to wonder, why is this one story important? Well, if you ask that question, I'm glad you did, because that's where we're going today. He tells us about this one important story in verse 41, 42. Luke writes, "Every year his parents traveled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom of the festival." So we have a trip to the Passover. And Jerry read for us earlier what was instructed back, Moses recorded in Deuteronomy, the instructions of the people. And it says that all the males of age, which would be 13 years and older, were to travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year for 3 specific festivals. And what we see here is the festival of unleavened bread, of which the Passover was part of. It was held in spring. We ought to understand this because Easter falls in the spring, and this is our tie into this. Luke tells us that Joseph and Mary went every year. Now, he doesn't tell us if Jesus went every year as a baby, as a young child. Maybe he was left behind with some family or friends or neighbors or something like that. We're not told that. We are told that specifically this year Jesus went. We know that he went this year because he was 12 years old. And why this is important is that next year he'll be 13 and he will be expected to go and participate. And what they would do as 12-year-olds, they would accompany Dad on this pilgrimage so they could see what's going on. So Jesus is here to learn about the religious heartbeat of his people. His experience would have gone something like this. And let me say, this is a bunch of information from a bunch of different resources, but this is kind of a summary of what we feel like this would have been like for Jesus. At the time, there would have been about 200,000 extra people headed toward Jerusalem, kind of like it feels on the streets of Murfreesboro. About 200,000 extra people that crammed themselves into the walled city of Jerusalem. Every available space, if you remember back, we talked about in Bethlehem, people would rent out an extra room to guests. Same scenarios going here. Everything is rented out to the point that people are camping in tents outside of the city wall. Merchants would line the streets coming into the city and inside the city. They're selling, this is 3 times a year they have these crowds. This is time to make money. They are selling their stuff. This was also an opportune time for beggars. They would station themselves at the city gates, and as people would come in, they would beg for money. But out of everything that is going on, the most intense location, the most intense activity is happening at the sheep stalls. Many of these 200,000 people have traveled quite some distance, so instead of bringing their sacrifice, they would purchase a sacrifice there at the temple. There'll be another story about that later on. But right now we see the people, they're trying to buy the sacrificial lamb. And there's a lot of activity happening. On Passover day, as the sun comes up, there was an intensity in the city. It's not the same thing, but I want to compare it to our Christmas morning. The enthusiasm and the excitement. And by the way, we ought to have that on Easter morning, but I don't think we quite are there yet. But there was this insane almost activity going on. Normally there was one contingent of priests that took care of all the stuff in the temple. If you remember back, we talked about Zechariah being part of that. On this day, all 24 contingents were there because they were all needed. At 3 in the afternoon, all the adult males, the head of the households, and whether that was an individual house or conglomerate of houses, but those that were going to be sharing the Passover meal together, the head of that household would be at the temple with the sacrificial lamb. And so in this case, Joseph would have been there with the sacrificial lamb, and today specifically, Jesus is by his side to see what is expected of him in the future. As the sacrifices were made, the Levites sang the Hallel songs. And Joseph would dress the lamb and then wrap it back in its own skin, throw it over his shoulder, and take back to wherever they were staying. All this time, Jesus is taking this in. He is seeing what's going on, and he's just shadowing his father, his earthly father. This lamb would have been prepared and roasted over a pomegranate spit. And then as the sun went down, the family would join together and they would share a meal. It was a meal that was designed to be very joyful. It was interspersed with different activities of hand washing, of prayers, of the Hallel psalms being sung. And at the proper time, the oldest male child, and we might kind of assume this is Jesus this year, he would ask the question, why is this night different from all other nights? and the head of the household, the father of the household, would then begin to recount the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt, their deliverance, their salvation. The night itself ended late. After dinner and after all the ceremony that went with it, they would stay up. Many people returning to the streets for more celebrations. They awaited at midnight the gates, the doors to the temple would reopen. And people would flood in for a time of worship, a time of prayer. This Passover celebration was the center of the whole week. It was a week-long celebration. And so there were a lot of things that were going on in the city of Jerusalem. And Luke's indication is that Jesus just could not get enough of this. That he was trying to absorb it, to take it all in, but he couldn't do it all in the 1 week, because he wrote this, starting in verse 43. After those days were over, after the week is over, as they were returning back to Nazareth, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming he was in the traveling party, they went a day's journey. They began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. Now we have the search. Now, I think we can understand this concept. We may not understand all of it, but we understand the concept. The people from Nazareth and Galilee area would travel in a caravan. It was much safer in a large group to travel during those times. And so you would have family and friends and neighbors that would all be traveling together. Well, I think we kind of understand this. You know, maybe the guys are over here and they're talking about, you know, work, and they're talking about, you know, adding on to the house, and they're talking about some guy things, right? And the ladies are over here and they're talking about their husbands. All they want to talk about is building on the house, right? Now, and then the kids, they don't want to listen to either one of those conversations going on, so they kind of hang out together, and they're playing, and they're running ahead, and they're doing their thing. I think we can kind of understand that. So we can kind of understand that as they began to return, that Joseph and Mary did not recognize that Jesus was with them. The part that I don't understand is I think I would make sure he was here before we started. But that didn't happen. And so they travel for a whole day, and they getting ready to settle down for the night, and they're looking around for Jesus, and they can't find him. Since Jesus never sinned, we must presume that the act was unintentional. It was not something that was planned out. It wasn't that he was going, you know what, I'm going to hide and see how far my parents get before they recognize I'm gone. It wasn't an act of disobedience. It just seems that Luke seems to indicate that this 12-year-old Jesus was so totally absorbed in everything that was going on in the holy city that he just lost track of time. He didn't realize that the family had left. He had missed the caravan going home. Regardless, Jesus gave his parents a major scare. As I said, thinking that he was with the company, they just traveled for a whole day, and when they stopped and couldn't find him, they began to panic. Now, I understand a little bit of how Joseph and Mary may have felt, because back in 2006, Lori and myself, our family, Lori's sister and her family took a trip to a little place called Disney World. And at this time, between the two families, we had 7 kids, all under the age of 11. So we've got a lot of stuff going on. We've got strollers, and we've got bags, and we've got this, and we've got that. And we're at the Magic Kingdom, and we're getting ready to go on what I call the greatest ride on the planet, the Jungle Cruise. Some of y'all will disagree with me, but you have the right to be wrong. I love the Jungle Cruise, one of my favorite rides. And we're getting ready to go on that, and we decided to take a little snack break before we got on the ride. And we're kind of up around the corner in a little area, and we've got all the kids are out, and we're doing the snack thing, and we pack everybody back up, and we go around down just a short ways, actually, to the Jungle Cruise. And as we're getting ready to go on, we're counting heads, and there's only 10. There's one missing. 7. There's only 6. So okay, I don't know how many kids I've got anymore. There's only 6. One of them is missing. My 9-year-old son, Bryant, is missing. And so, no big deal. I go back to get him. So I go back up around the corner. Where we were, there's no Bryant. I'm thinking he caught back up. I didn't see him. I go back to the family. He's not there. Now we begin to panic a little bit. We're fanning out. We're looking for him. We're trying to see. We talk to a cast member. They're starting to look for him. I'll be really honest. There's a sinking feeling that I can't describe in my heart and my soul and my pit of my stomach. I can't find my son. And then my phone rings. And this is how I answer the phone. Did you find my son? And they're like, yes. Now, we had told our kids, if you ever get lost, find a police officer. They can help get you back to us. And so that's what went through Bryant's mind. And so he begins to look for a police officer. You don't find police officers in Disney World. You find cast members. We didn't tell him that. He got all the way back to the front of the park, which is about a day's journey, before he finds a police officer. And walks up to the police officer. He had a little tag that had number. He walks up to the police officer and says, "Can you call my father?" They call us, we get reunited, everything's fine. Matter of fact, to be rewarded for worrying us so much, they let him drive the boat on the Jungle Cruise. The one thing I have wanted to do my whole life. I figure all I need to do is get lost and worry somebody, I can get on the Jungle. No. I tell this story to say I have a little bit of a small understanding of what Mary and Joseph might have been going through. As Mary is calling out, "Jesus!" in a good way, "Jesus!" And Joseph is running from, tent to tent and bed to bed. Hey, when's the last time you saw Jesus? Anybody's thinking maybe he's bunking down with a neighbor or something. But they're panicking. They realize, I bet he's back in Jerusalem. That's a whole day away. For those of us that are parents, to think your 12-year-old is a whole day away, that's panic. Now, Luke doesn't tell us if they headed back right then, if they tried to get some sleep before they head out the next morning. There's lots of questions here that Luke just doesn't provide for us, but he just simply reports. Luke very calmly reports. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all those who heard him were astonished at his understanding and his answers. Now we move to the discovery. After Joseph and Mary got back to Jerusalem, they found him. He's fine. He's in the temple and he's engaged in talking with and listening to the religious leaders. Amazingly, as a 12-year-old, he's asking insightful questions. He's even understanding what they're telling him. And as he converses, they realize this kid is brilliant. He understands. It said they were astounded with his comprehension. Now, I want us to remember back a few weeks ago when we were talking about Jesus being born. I said that he had to learn how to do things like every other child does. He had to learn how to eat like a child. He had to learn how to walk like a child does. He had to learn about all kinds of things. And what we see here is it playing out. He is beginning to learn and understand who he is. And what I want to, we don't have to see Jesus as an all-knowing or even as a genius. Rather, I think what we see is a young man that is focused on what was really important in life. And maybe that's a miracle within itself for those of us that have known 12-year-olds. And for those of us that have been 12-year-olds. Jesus was focused on what was really important. Now, again, Luke does not tell us this, but I just have to believe that in 12 years of his life, that his parents have told him over and over and over who he is. They've told him the story. They've told him the story about how Gabriel came to them. They told him the story about the angels singing at his birth. They told him about the shepherds coming and finding him. I just think they had to tell him this all the time. As a matter of fact, I can hear Mary saying something like this: Jesus, all parents think their children are special, but you're the Son of God. And then Jesus asks, well, Mom, where do babies come from? And she says, go talk to Joseph. Joseph's going to handle that part, right? I believe Joseph took Jesus to the synagogue. And as the scriptures were being read, the Old Testament was being read, those stories of God are being read, Joseph would nudge him and go, listen, they're talking about your father. They're talking about who you are. I think Jesus has been told this, and he understood. And he understood what was important, and he was focused on it. Now, when Mary and Joseph finally did find Jesus, Mom responded like any other frightened mom would respond. Verse 48, Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. And again, Luke does not tell us the details, but in my mind, the picture is that Joseph and Mary, through tears of joy, they're hugging on Jesus, they're kissing on Jesus. But once it had settled in that he's okay, Mama Mary comes out. And literally in the Greek, what she said was, we've been suffering in pain looking for you. In other words, the way my mother would have said it was, you almost scared me to death. Don't you ever do that again. You know, Mary was human, right? She was a mother. And she responded in love like a loving mother would respond. And then Jesus' response. Jesus' response seems to be like, and if you've been around small children, you've probably seen this happen. They get so engrossed in playing with something or doing something that you can walk in and they never even know you're there. And I think that's what happened to Jesus. He was so engrossed in talking to these religious leaders and learning about the religious system that he is now a part of or about to be a part of. He got so caught up in it that time meant absolutely nothing to him. And he responds in verse 49, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" Again, Jesus does not sin. He doesn't lie. He doesn't try to make excuses. He just simply indicates, you've been telling me that God is my Father for my whole life. Now I'm at home. I want to learn about my Father. I want to know everything I can know about Him. What we see is that as a 12-year-old, why Luke, I think, included this story is because as a 12-year-old, Jesus had come to understand that he had a unique relationship with God the Father. One that is far deeper and more profound than any had known before and any will know since. I want to catch the idea. He has called God his Father. And I want you to understand how radical that was. They didn't do that. Matter of fact, God was called Abraham's father, but Abraham never referred to God as my father. We'll find out much later on, wordage like this is partly what set the religious leaders on a path to kill Jesus. This is not something you said anywhere. And yet, what we see when Jesus talks about God, he always calls him my Father. He understood the relationship. I want us to remind us to remember that in all this, Jesus never sinned. When his parents confronted him, Luke recorded in verse 51, "Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother kept all these things in her heart." It literally says that he was obeying them. In other words, it was ongoing. This was something that he did on a regular basis. This continued obedience. I think what we see is that Jesus, in his awareness that God is his Father, knew that he had to obey his earthly parents. It was his spiritual connection that caused his human obedience. Because he knew who he was, he could profoundly obey. And then Luke finishes this story, this part of Jesus' life, with a summary similar to verse 40. He says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with people." This word that we have translated here, favor, in verse 40 is translated as grace. It's the exact same word. It's charis in the Greek. And it means grace, particularly grace that causes joy and pleasure. In other words, Jesus was a delight. People liked him. He was polite. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He was understanding. He listened. I think, laughed. I think one of the greatest problems, that's a strong term, but the greatest problem we see Jesus as solemn, just stoic. I see Jesus as one sitting around the campfire just laughing and having a great time. I think he enjoyed life, and he expects us to enjoy life too. Because he was grace. He was joy. And for the next 18 years, Luke indicates that Jesus grew into a man that was graced, that was a joy in his relationship with God the Father. He was graced. He was a joy for his parents. He was graced. He was joy for the people that he came in contact with, his neighbors, his friends, his family. He brought joy. And what we're going to see is this is just the beginning of the joy that he brings and he offers to each of us. I want to end with a couple applications. Maybe you've already had yours. Maybe you've already written down your application, but I want to give you two as we think about Jesus' obedience to his earthly parents and his heavenly Father. First, an obedient, submissive inner spirit comes from knowing who we are. An obedient, submissive inner spirit comes from knowing who we are. Jesus was at a point in life where he was beginning to understand, to know who he is. Jesus understood that. And what came out of that was submission, obedience, doing what was asked of him. Now, for you and me, when we accept Jesus as our Savior, we have a union with him that makes God our Father too. And just as the Apostle John exclaimed in his first letter, "Dear friends, we are God's children now." We are God's children now. He is our Father. And our awareness that we belong to him ought to make us want to obey him, to do what he is asking of us, and also to understand that being his children empowers us to do whatever it is he asks us to do. It empowers us for his glory and for the glory of others. Notice that that last verse said that he had a relationship with the Father, he had a relationship with others. Jesus was the ultimate example of love God, love people. When we know who we are, it makes living life that way so much easier. The second thing is, an obedient, submissive inner spirit is a key to experiencing proper spiritual growth. When we know who we are, when we submit ourselves, when we are obedient, then we can echo the words of Isaiah, "Here am I, send me." Or as Paul said it, we present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. And when we present ourselves as a sacrifice, then God can use us, in the words of Paul to the Ephesians, to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. In other words, when we know who we are, when we're in a right relationship with God, when we're growing in our spiritual life, then he can use us. And then we begin to think more about others than we do ourselves. Then he can use us. Then we begin to think more about others than we think about ourselves. Then he can use... Y'all see a pattern going here? But we have to make a choice. Are we going to live for self? Or are we going to live for our Father? And he loves you enough to let you make the choice yourself. So today, what will you choose? Will you choose to live a life like this 12-year-old Jesus, searching and wanting to know and to learn about God the Father so that you can submit your life to him? Or do you just want to live your own life? In just a moment, we're going to sing a song, and as we do, it's our opportunity to reflect and respond. What is God asking of you? What is he saying to you today? What do you need to do? And will you commit to doing it? Will you commit to living the life he's called you to? If you've never accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, I'll be here at the front, and I would be happy to talk with you about what that means, what that entails, to help walk you through that path. Today is a great day to live for Jesus.